Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the KDPG Sunday edition. I'm Ken Rice. A little more than 1 year into his presidency, President Donald Trump went before Congress and the American people last Tuesday night to deliver his first State of the Union address. For an unconventional political leader who's made his mark with highly effective, sometimes unconventional ways of communicating, plus the frequent use of Twitter, President Trump gave a very traditional speech and talked about the accomplishments of his first year in office. CNN's KDKA-TV has more on what has been achieved and the challenges that lie ahead.
Unemployment claims have hit a 45-year low.
President Trump highlighting the accomplishments of his first year in office, particularly the economy, while also looking forward, calling on Congress to work with him on plans for a massive infrastructure overhaul, promising Americans there's more to come.
Since the election, we have created 2.4 million new jobs, including 200,000 new jobs in manufacturing alone.
But the unifying words and outreach to the other side of the aisle were met with skepticism by many Democrats. Congressman Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts gave a special party response.
This administration isn't just targeting the laws that protect us. They're targeting the very idea that we are all worthy of protection.
Compromise will be needed if Congress and the White House want to avoid another government shutdown when the latest continuing resolution expires February 8th. Key to that debate, immigration.
The first pillar of our framework generously offers a path to citizenship for 1.8 million illegal immigrants who were brought here by their parents at a young age. That covers almost 3 times more people than the previous administration covered.
On Capitol Hill, I'm KDKA-TV.
This morning on the KDPG Sunday edition, we'll look at some of the issues facing Congress and the presidency in this midterm election year. A little later, we'll be joined by Dr. Kristen Allen, visiting assistant professor of political science at Duquesne University. But right now we welcome 2 other guests. Dr. Kristen Kantak is an associate professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh, and Dr. Lawrence Alice is an associate professor of economics at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business. David Shribman, executive editor of the Post-Gazette, is alongside. Nice to have you here, David, and welcome to both of you. So as a political scientist, Dr. Kantak, let me get your opinion first. Does the State of the Union matter in 2018 in the age of Twitter and Facebook and other forms of instant digital communication?
It matters in the sense that it's an institution, right? It's in the Constitution says the president has to do this. He doesn't have to give it in person, right? But the institutions are still exactly the same. So in the midst of all of this kind of tumult that we're seeing with the Trump presidency, this is normalcy, right? The stuff that's in the Constitution hasn't changed.
People have said that President Trump has challenged or violated norms in many ways. Is there something reassuring to someone who sort of follows the arc of the American experiment to see a traditional State of the Union address?
Sure, and I think it was also reassuring that everybody sort of thought he would give a normal State of the Union address, which is what he did, right? He didn't. This is someone who can go way off script and say some really outlandish things, and there was an expectation that he wouldn't do that, right? But the State of the Union has been a little odd for a few years, right? We had during the Obama administration, we had Joe Wilson shouting, "You lie." So this predates Donald Trump, right? He's really more of a symptom rather than the actual thing that's doing
anything abnormal about this speech, the event itself? You know, the standing ovation on one side of the chamber, the sitting with the dour faces on the other side. What struck you? What was your takeaway, if anything?
It was sort of how normal it was, okay, right? How much it was just like every other speech. I think every other State of the Union speech, it's always true that the out party sits there with sour faces and the in party claps and is excited. I think the only difference is that Trump clapped for himself, which is not something that we've seen before.
Right.
That was slightly unsettling, but you know, if you read the speech and didn't hear it, and you looked at, say, Lyndon Johnson's 65 State of the Union address, which I'm sure you did, but I mean, there were passages there that could have been written by Ted Sorensen or by Dick Goodwin. Then there were other references that were really much more outre. But I mean, there were a lot of things there that had a traditional kind of lyricism that you don't hear from President Trump very often, and that you really do identify with Ted Sorensen and John Kennedy. And did that strike you at all?
Absolutely. There was very little red meat, right, in this speech to sort of throw to his to the people who really love Donald Trump. We saw a little at the end in terms of immigration, but even that was delivered with kind of the same sort of presidentialism that we saw with the rest of it. But yeah, in terms of the big takeaways being spending on infrastructure, that's not what we would usually expect from a Republican presidency.
Well, Dr. Ellis, that leads me to you. As a professor of economics, what stuck out about the speech to you?
Well, it gave a nice picture. That's what it meant to be, a snapshot of the economy. It touches all of the key aspects that we expect to see in this picture, the labor markets and the implication of the tax reform. Those, I think, are the most interesting aspect. I think for the average viewer, I think the implication of the tax reform must be at the forefront of their mind. So most of your viewers probably got a bump in their paycheck just last week, given change in tax retention. So I think the headline number there was an average of $4,000 per worker. I would encourage also to kind of unpack this number, see what it means for different type of workers. The tax changes are large. However, we get a sense on how it might impact the different income groups. So at the latest simulation I see that people in the lowest quintile see $28,000 and below. They might get over the course of 2018 an increase of around $60 to $100. People in the top quintile, $7,000 and above. So yes, there will be an implication. People have seen it right away. There will be a bit of an equal implication of this tax reform.
And in your opinion, is the president justified in taking the credit for the good things happening in the economy? Democrats would say, well, this started under Obama, and he's reaping the benefits.
Right. So an exercise I always do with my students is kind of bring the one snapshot into context. Let's take the unemployment number, this 4.1. An exercise I make my students do is, when you look at the entire data, over the last 10 years, they line up straight into a line, which means that the trend, whatever was set in motion from 2010, is still continuing. So this is good. We're going in the right direction, but there is much more than a presidency in shaping the engine of the economy.
Right. And when David, go ahead.
Well, presidents, they take credit and get blamed for what happens. I mean, Jim Stewart in the New York Times on Friday morning had a piece that examined every element of the economy and basically agreed with you and you with him that it's too early to tell whether there was a Trump bump, but there surely is a sense that this is a pro-business president. How much does that affect the economy? And then I want to ask Professor Kantak, if he's such a pro-business president, does that hurt does his base resent that? So first you.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's going to be key. A way in which some of these proposals, both infrastructure and tax plan, are going to be paid for. The idea is for a spurring growth. Growth at the moment is just about average. Okay, so going into next year, what I would really be interested to see is an increase in both corporate investment and corporate productivity growth. One red flag that I saw is that productivity, this is how productive is your average worker, actually declined in the last quarter of 2017. So that number needs to, change sign and grow.
Oh, interest rates are creeping up.
Right.
Right. So Professor Kantak, your half of the question, does he endanger his relationship with his base by being a pro-business president?
So the answer to that question throughout our knowledge of how public opinion works is, yeah, it should. But I think we're at a different time in our American political history where we have people who are interested in labels, Democrat and Republican, but they don't necessarily tie to specific policies, right? So we're not seeing people react to policies in the same way that we had, right? It's more which team are you on? And the other team's a bad guy, regardless of what happens. So what they're more likely to do is decide that a pro-business administration is good for them than they are to turn on Trump because he seems more pro-business.
There was no mention of the debt or the deficit during the speech. There was a time in Washington not too long ago when you couldn't talk about massive spending programs without talking about, well, where would that money come from? What are you going to cut? That wasn't part of the conversation last Tuesday night. As a professor of economics, does it concern you to hear a president propose $1.5 trillion in infrastructure spending without talking about where that money might be sourced?
Right, for sure, that's going to be a tricky point in the sense that at the moment, the one thing we can see for sure is that deficits in 2018, 2019, the Congressional Budget Office plans to stable and increasing. So here, two things will have to happen. Either growth picks up, and or there is a political coordination into cutting spending. So neither of these are easy targets to achieve. Hence, not talking in the State of the Union would be a good strategy.
What about the politics of the deficit? It doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was 25 years ago that Ross Perot built a campaign on trying to get people's attention focused on deficit spending. Where is it now as an issue? Why don't we hear any objections, at least initially, to what the president's proposing?
So our attitude about the debt and the deficit in Congress has really changed, right? For most of the time, we've had an appropriations committee who felt like it was their job to be very stingy with spending. And that's not the case anymore. That's not what we see out of our appropriations committee. And for a long time, right, we had this sort of attitude that the Democrats were the pro-spending people and the Republicans were kind of the more fiscally conservative and the more worried about debt and deficit. But now we're in a situation where it doesn't seem like anybody cares.
It just feels so good to watch the stock market keep going up and up.
Right.
And deficits, we'll take care of those down the road.
Right, and that's the problem, is that the economy's doing well now, right? These are the times where maybe you should be thinking about spending it down rather than spending it back up, right? We're not saving for a rainy day. This is a pretty sunny day.
Right. All right, we, on that note, are going to take a break. When we come back, the political realities of partisan gridlock between Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill and at the White House. Duquesne University's Dr. Kristen Kupiale will join us when we return.